Have you ever heard the term liminality used in an article or even in a classroom or in a conversation? So today, just a little bit about liminality, what it means, where does it come from, and how best to use it in literary studies, but also in cultural studies and other fields of academic studies. So here we go. So I just recently did a live stream, and one of the questions that was raised in it, a comment where someone requested to record a video on liminality as a concept. So most of what I'm going to say, there are not going to be clear references to who wrote what about it. I will post those links in the description to the video, but I'll generally be speaking about the term itself. Now, the root for liminality, of course, is liminal. And it literally means or could mean two things. One, a threshold. That means something that exists between two spaces or two entities that occupies both. And that is what we will consider a threshold. You're neither here nor there. You're somewhere in between. And another connotation of the term comes from anthropology, where it is sort of a beginning of a ritual, a beginning of a rite of passage. Actually, anthropology is where the term was first kind of used in a specialized sense, and that was that in any given culture or subculture, even if you're an outsider or insider, when you are negotiating a rite of passage into that culture, into that community, you are ceasing to be who you are, and you are not yet what you will become. And that transition, the initial process of a rite of passage, is liminal, right? And that condition has a certain degree of liminality. You could apply it to any conditions, like in native cultures, in indigenous cultures, if there are rites of passage from, let's say, young children to adulthood, if there are certain processes that they must go through, then while they have initiated the process of transitioning from one state of being to taking an actual role in their culture, the process, the beginning of it, entering it, is liminal, because you are ceasing to be who you are, and you have not yet been either totally accepted or become what constitutes being in that culture. So in that sense, that is liminality. In literature, liminal is used in different ways. For example, if you've taken a course on Shakespeare, you would be taught that sometimes in Shakespeare's plays, there is a green space, right, where some action happens, but it is a liminal space because the play always comes back to the city or comes back to where it started. In cultural studies and postcolonial studies, anything that is neither this nor that, but something in between, is liminal. So how does liminality work? The idea, one might assume that by suggesting that it's a threshold and it's a beginning part of a ritual, that at a certain point you leave the liminal space and then become whatever you think you ought to after the initiating process. I think it is more complicated than that. A lot of times we retain our assumed identities somewhat, but they are also mostly liminal. How, you might ask? So, for example, I'm originally from Pakistan. I've lived in America for almost 30 years. In so many ways, the way I think the world, the way I interact with it, it is pretty American. But in terms of my racial identity, my accent, the way I view the world. Quite a lot of people in United States will not view me as an American, right? So I have that liminal identity where they can kind of guess that I am American because, I practice some of the American values, but then there is a certain degree of liminality attached to it. And you never really feel fully accepted. Now, is that a problematic space to be in? I don't think so. Like if you go by Homi Bhabha and others, the liminal space in a way is the most productive because you have retained traces of who you were and you are adopting or adopted the practices of where you're headed. So you have an abundance of qualities or characteristics, culturally speaking, political speaking, or otherwise. So in that sense, liminality could be a positive trait, right? And it could be a more transformative way of being in the world. I mean, liminality can also enable us to be more tolerant because if we are not committed to either this or that, and if we are somewhere in between, then we are open to conversations, dialogue on either side of the so-called threshold. So I see it as a positive thing. It can be used against you in political rhetoric because political rhetoric mostly depends on hardened positions, well articulated, well practiced. So if you're ambivalent and if you're liminal in your arguments, in your writing even, then you can very easily be scapegoated or derided as being weak, indecisive. So overall, I think it is kind of related to hybridity as Bhabha discusses. It's the only difference is that for Bhabha, everything is hybrid, so hence it becomes a stable entity. Because there are no thresholds to cross. You incorporate some, you jettison some, and you create something that is not pure. Liminal, on the other hand, presupposes that you are in transition. You are in the state of becoming. So when you're in the state of becoming, you are leaving the abode of where you were, right? But you haven't yet entered what you ought to become or what you aspire to become. It comes across as a transitional position. But as I mentioned, it can also be a perpetual state of mind or state of being in the world, depending on where you are. So how do you use it in literary studies? Right? We could look at a character and see if the character acts as if they are in a liminal space, if their identity is in flux and fluid. We could look at the text itself and see if it is liminal, right? If it is not taking absolute stances, either this or that, but giving us a worldview that is liminal, that is transitional and maybe transformal, right? And these are some of the ways in which we can use the concept in reading literature or writing about literature. If you decide to use it in your teaching or in your writing, I highly recommend, getting a thorough understanding of it from the anthropological field and also from literary studies, and then see how can you approach a text from a liminal perspective, not from Pakistan or America, from a perspective that in itself is not hardened, right? Or a position that is not either on this side or on that side. And maybe that will be really productive. If I could use an example from my own work, my last book, Democratic Criticism, places the authorial voice in that liminal space. Because on the one hand, what I'm trying to argue is that we need to look at the satanic verses in a different way, which in itself is neither how the West would see it, nor how the Muslims would see it, but rather how it is received, right, in the West and in the Muslim world. And then let's go into the details of why do the Muslims feel offended? Why do they feel enraged at the text? And what is wrong with just insisting from the West that people should read it the way people in the West are reading it? And then on the other hand, engaging with the idealized Muslim readers and discussing that maybe there ought to be a space where we hold on to what we believe in and let the others read a certain text the way they want to read. So that's kind of a certain degree of liminality into it, because no single position is better than the other, but both positions in a way can hold in balance. So these are some of my thoughts on liminality. I'm sorry I haven't gone into specific texts and explained how someone wrote about it. I think that is more apt if you explore it on your own. And as I said, whatever sources I can gather on it, I will post them in the description. But this could probably serve as just a brief introduction if you're curious about the concept. So let me know what you think. I hope it is useful, and always feel free to educate me if I could have done it differently. That's all. Thank you so much. Stay safe, take care, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.